I'm really, really delighted to be here, and I want to thank the conference organisers for bringing me. I'm just going to ask one favour of everybody. A couple of the slides have original documents from the 17th century in them. Please don't take photographs, because those are copyright documents, and the archive could stop me going there if they think I'm not doing things within copyright. So I'd be really grateful if you would just look at them and admire them and not take photographs of them. This paper, I'm just going to do I always apologise at the beginning of papers. I don't know why. I probably need to go back to therapy. But this paper began... I had a fellowship at Rice University late last year, and a fantastic time, and I thought, oh good, I get a chance to write about Edward Topsail's History of Four-Footed Beasts, a book that I have looked at throughout my study of animals in the early modern period, which is since the beginning of my PhD. I thought it would be about an article long, and so it would be perfect when I was invited to give a paper here, to give a paper on it. It's turned into a much more amorphous project. I don't know whether it's an animal that's trying to break out of its cage or a body breaking through the buttons in its shirt, or what the analogy is. But anyway, the paper is 45 minutes long. I think the project is probably 45,000 words long, and I apologise. And if you want to ask questions about stuff I'm not touching on, hopefully I might have something prodding towards an answer. Okay, I want to start with a quotation from Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer's Leviathan and the Air Pump. This book, published in 1985 and now considered a classic in the history of science, asked, why does one do experiments in order to arrive at scientific truth? That is, it set out to understand how, in the 17th century, one particular method came to be regarded as the only authoritative source of fact in science. And the book begins with an outline of the position that Shapin and Schaffer are going to take in their interpretation of the debates between Thomas Hobbes and Robert Boyle. So this is a quote. The member's account and its associated self-evident method have great instinctive appeal. The social forces that protect and sustain them are powerful. The member who poses awkward questions about what everybody knows in the shared culture runs a real risk of being dealt with as a troublemaker or an idiot. Indeed, there are few more reliable ways of being expelled from a culture than of continuing seriously to query its taken-for-granted intellectual framework. Playing the stranger is therefore a difficult business. A genuine stranger is simply ignorant. Now, in the light of this dilemma that they set up, Shapin and Schaffer propose that they will, and again I'm quoting, adopt a calculated and informed suspension of our taken-for-granted perceptions of experimental practices and its products. By playing the stranger, we hope to move away from self-evidence. If we pretend to be a stranger to experimental culture, we can seek to appropriate one great advantage the stranger has over the member in explaining the beliefs and practices of a specific culture. The stranger is in a position to know that there are alternatives to those beliefs and practices. Now, in this paper, I'm not looking at the emergence of experimental science as they were. Rather, I'm looking at the natural historical discourse that experimental science can be said to have displaced by the mid-17th century. But the method proposed by Shapin and Schaffer offers me a useful starting point. So unlike them, they claim they're not strangers, but are offering a calculated and informed suspension of taken-for-granted perceptions. I've discovered in the process of this research that I am caught between being a member of the culture that I'm looking at, being someone who is pretending to be a stranger, but also being a genuine stranger in the world I'm analysing. I'm asking questions that perhaps members have long had answers for, but I'm also asking questions that they did not and have not asked. And so I will deliberately sound like an outsider rather than an insider. In addition, I'm asking questions that perhaps only a real stranger can ask. And ironically, one of the things I'll talk about is that these strange questions, the questions that genuinely come from outside of the discourse, emerge from the fact that I did know, at a crucial moment in my research, exactly where I was. The walk I took, a literal walk, and I'll come back to it, was the walk of a resident, of someone familiar with the lie of the land. And that walk, that entrance into the public sphere, disrupted all familiarity. It's in the move from the archive into the street, from the private space of reading into the public space of physical encounter, that this realisation emerged. And so this paper looks at a text with which I thought I was familiar and asks it strange questions by recognising that where it was made was important. Now, this seems like an obvious move to make, and yet what emerges from the recognition is not only a revised reading of a specific text and a revised reading of the culture which it is a product of, and I think I'm a product of it, and probably we are all potentially products of the culture that made it. In addition, I hope that this reading of one early 17th century book will open up broader questions about what we are able to speak about when we speak about animals, how we speak about them, and how what is unspeakable comes into being and what purpose it serves. And I was just in the session on dairy cows, and I think there is a real relationship between what I was hearing there and what I'm talking about in the 17th century. Okay. So Edward Topsail's History of Four-Footed Beasts. It's just bad early modern spelling. They didn't standardise spelling until much later. This text has been variously described as an anthology, a redaction, a compilation, a translation, a condensation. It's based on the first volume of the Historia Animalium of Conrad Gesner from the mid-16th century. Topsail followed his History of Four-Footed Beasts a year later in 1608 with the History of Serpents, and an existing manuscript of his study of birds called The Fowls of Heaven dates from circa 1613 to 14 and remained unfinished at his death in 1625. He'd got as far as the letter C. It's really sad. Although it would have been a massive book. So the History of Four-Footed Beasts is used by historians and literary critics as a source of late Renaissance animal lore. It's where you go to find out the myths and legends circulating in the period about animals. Thus, one learns about elephants, and all these pictures, I'm sorry, they're very, very starkly black and white. They're downloaded from a scanned copy online, on early English books online. So thus one learns about elephants, not only their size, but also that, quote, they are so loving to their fellows that they will not eat their meat alone, but having found a prey, they go and invite the residue to their feasts and cheer, more like to reasonable civil men than unreasonable brute beasts. In addition, Topsail notes that elephants can understand the language of the country in which they were born and can be taught to write in the sand with sticks. These stories are reported because of their presence in ancient sources. That is the form of authority, the empiricism, the scientific discourse that Chapin and Schaeffer are analysing. This is what it comes to displace. Now, the function of a text such as Topsail's is somewhat alien to us. The conventions that he was following regarded animals as a source of meanings on many levels. They had a utilitarian function, of course. Topsail looks at their edibility, at the medicinal value of their various body parts, and he also... But animals are also meaningful in other ways. They can be, for example, allegorically significant. And such allegorical meaning has an equal place in his work to their medicinal use. Thus, it's hard not to read this creature called the lamia, a creature with exemptile, that is, removable eyes. I love the word exemptile, we should reintroduce it. This creature with... hard not to read the lamia as a misogynist warning against women. Quote, as often as they go from home, they put in their eyes, wandering abroad, entering into the assemblies of men and prying, he says. Once at home, however, these lamias, sluttish creatures as they are, remove their eyes again and are blind to what is going on around them. Now, despite there being no lamias in 17th century England, this monstrous creature's existence goes unquestioned because it's referred to by Aristophanes, by Philostratus, and can be linked, Topsail argues, to creatures referred to in the Bible. But it's also accepted as real because it serves an allegorical function. So as Topsail says, quote, as they, lamias, see a man, they lay open their breasts, and by the beauty thereof entice them to come near to conference, and so having them within their compass, they devour and kill them, unquote. So the lamia exhibits feminine traits most feared and loathed by many male writers in the period. So Joseph Swetnam, for one, noted the power of women to, quote, make men drunk with their devices, end quote. So in the figure of the lamia, then, the perceived danger of women is represented as natural, and women are made to be like animals in one move. And if you notice, the Lamia has a penis, so she's a truly unnatural woman. Animals, therefore, present dangers, but they can have positive virtues too. They can teach us to be better humans in this discourse. And Topsail's work is full of such creatures. So the elephant's generosity in inviting his fellows to supper reminds us that we too should be open-handed. Likewise, good behaviour can be learnt from a lion. This king of beasts offers lessons to a human ruler in his cunning behaviour when being hunted. So Topsail says, so wisely tempering his fear before his foes that it may seem a boldness, and so politically when he thinketh no eye seeth him, no longer dissembleth with himself, but runneth away like a fearful hart or hare. Lions are also reportedly fair in taking revenges for injuries, so they hurt no more than they are harmed, Topsail says. Another useful lesson for a ruler. But there's also a possible religious allegory too, and this is perhaps the reason why lions are perceived to be the kings of beasts. Topsail repeats from the medieval bestiary tradition the story that lion whelps were believed to be senseless for the first 3 days of their lives and quickened, that's his word, only with the roar of the lion. So this is a bestiary image of this happening. Like Christ in the tomb, the lion cubs awake on the 3rd day to the majesty of their father's voice. And in doing such, lions perhaps should be also regarded as signs of the truth, the natural truth of the resurrection. So in his stories, his use of stories from the bestiary tradition and his reliance on classical and scriptural sources, then Topsail offered a view of the world in which understanding an elephant required not so much an experience of seeing or perhaps even dissecting the animal as a knowledge of its name in various languages, the places where it's found, its size and appearance, the nature and poetic use of ivory, the animal's understanding, what it eats, its mode of reproduction and sexual habits, its relation to water, its strategies in fighting, how to trap them, and their evasion tactics, how to tame them, their learning, their morality, age, edibility, diseases, and medicinal usage. Those are the topics covered in the chapter on elephants in the order they come in. So there's this kind of listing of everything as he perceived it. The History of Four-Footed Beasts, the book, was, you might say, written in a library rather than in a laboratory. It was written from other books rather than from experimentation. This, we should bear in mind, is not a failing on Topsail's part. It is the nature of the discourse that he is working within. So the History of Four-Footed Beasts is a text which assumes that animals' place, meaning, value and use was central to understanding the power of God. For Topsail, therefore, a manticore, this is a manticore, a beast or rather monster with a treble row of teeth beneath and above, with a wildness such as never can be tamed and an appetite especially for the flesh of men, this animal can sit alongside the rather more prosaic sheep, whose meekness is evidenced in its complete usefulness. He says there is no part but is profitable to man. So he goes through the guts, the hooves, the fur, the ears, everything is useful. Complete wildness and complete utility offer the range of God's creation. But if nature is for man, and of course it is gendered, it is man, then animal wildness must itself be interpretable, or else it escapes human usefulness and so eludes the attempt, as Milton has it, to justify the ways of God to men. The manticore, we are told, quote, is apt to leap and to run so as no distance or space to hinder him. And perhaps this untamable, unstoppable wildness should be read as a reminder of our own fallen state. Perhaps in the Protestant theology that was dominant in early modern England, the fall was understood to undermine human status, and the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil meant that the children of Adam were all innately corrupt. Animals, by extension, also fell from their prelapsarian condition of harmonious cohabitation into a savage and wild state because of the fall. And our labour in the sweat of your brow, as Genesis has it, is to tame, control, dominate what was once innately friendly, helpful, and obedient. Now, so alongside this interpretation of wildness, it's like a memento mori. It reminds us of our own state. Wildness with a human face. And I think it's no accident that manticores have the face of a human. So it's like a human wildness looking back at you. Alongside this wildness sits the sheep. And again, I think it's no accident that in this woodcut, the sheep is looking away, it's looking down. So the meekness is there in the woodcut. Its total usefulness, the sheep's total usefulness, alongside its meekness, leads to it possessing a specific symbolic value. And so when Topsail writes of the lambs discerning the voice of his parent, when lost amid a flock of thousands, he is reflecting a truth shepherds would recognise, but is also speaking allegorically. We are perhaps being asked to recall the obedience of Christ, always listening to his Father, and to remember our own capacity to stray. Now, I keep talking about the Christian narrative here, not because we all believe it, that is entirely up to you, but because this is what is believed by this text. Okay? So there's no point in questioning that narrative if you're going to read the text. Thus, the sheep recalls God's generosity to us, his fallen beings, in two ways, in terms of provision of material goods, of flesh, of wool, and so on, but also in terms of its role as a symbolic good, as a reminder of our status and of God's benevolence. Indeed, in another text printed in 1613, Topsail makes use of sheep once again. In The Reward of Religion, a series of sermons on the Book of Ruth, he writes of the faithful being compared to sheep, this is a quote, which are meek and silent, and the reprobate, those that are going to hell, the reprobate to dogs, which are always barking and brawling. Such animal imagery is used perhaps to bring home to listeners and readers, because these were sermons, so they would be heard as well as read. They bring home to readers the nature of true devotion. It's thus not unrelated to his natural historical work that Topsail was a Protestant minister. His career as cleric took him from Kent and Sussex in the south of England to being perpetual curate of a church in the city of London. And the History of Four-Footed Beasts was written while he held that curacy and was published by the Protestant printer William Jaggard, who is best known as the printer of Shakespeare's first folio in 1623. Jaggard was also Topsail's parishioner. And the History of Four-Footed Beasts, which is a folio volume, this is a big book with lots of woodcuts, so it's an expensive book, was likely to have been something like an act of piety on the part of the minister and his printer. Indeed, in Fowls of Heaven, Topsail makes clear that his motive for continuing his study of the natural world is a religious duty. He says, "It must needs be very noble that increaseth light in the heart of man to understand the revealed will and word of God. And this kind of divination you shall find in our history, which teacheth the meaning of texts of Scripture." So he's reading the natural world in order to read Scripture. There's this direct link. Now, while Topsail's work is very conventional in many ways, by 1607, the date that the History of Four-Footed Beasts was printed, Francis Bacon, the so-called father of modern science, was already theorising the emergent empiricism which was to become the dominant mode of scientific inquiry in the second half of the 17th century. Bacon's Advancement of Learning had been published 2 years earlier. The historian of ideas, Peter Harrison, has argued that for early empiricists such as Bacon and his followers, quote, allegory becomes a literary device rather than an approach to the world. But this does not mean that allegorical interpretation of the world disappears altogether. And Harrison goes on to note that nature continued to be regarded by many as theology for the unlettered. And it's possible that Topsail wrote the History of Four-Footed Beasts for other preachers as a kind of dictionary of animal lore that might be used to enliven sermons, to make them more tangible to the uneducated faithful. We are like vicious dogs and we should be like humble sheep is a kind of concrete way of thinking about reprobation and salvation. Now, such a reading of Topsail leaves him as a latecomer in a dying tradition, as an end point of a way of reading the world that was becoming outmoded even as his book was being printed. But that perhaps makes it more important to attempt to understand what it means to have a book of beasts that includes sheep and manticores, lions and lammergeiers, even as empiricism was becoming the dominant mode of inquiry into the natural world. One of the things I'm trying to do is to understand more fully how Topsail's book worked. why it was printed when it was, what it did in early modern England. I assume it served a purpose, and I am, to use Shapin and Schaffer's terms, adopting the position of the stranger, knowing something of the language. I hope I might ask questions that open up the text in new ways. Now, historian of natural philosophy William Ashworth Jr. has gone before me and has offered a guide to reading texts like The History of Four-Footed Beasts. In a series of articles, Ashworth has described works such as Topsails as being part of what he calls the emblematic worldview. He proposed that the world in which Topsail was putting together his book was one in which, and I'm quoting from Ashworth, animals were just one aspect of the intricate language of metaphor, symbols and emblems, unquote. Learning to read animals was a necessary aspect of Christian knowledge, as they were, and again I'm quoting, living creatures in the language of the Creator, unquote. Now, the logic of this view holds that this view of the world holds that if one is to understand God, one must understand both of his two books, and that is the Bible and the Book of Nature. The good Christian should work to recover the true meaning of God's creation, and its true meaning is not only zoological, medicinal or anatomical, it is also allegorical and emblematic. Thus, recognising that lion cubs embody the story of the resurrection, seeing in a lamb's identification of his mother a symbol of true faith, one can begin to get closer to the divine because one recognises that he is embodied on earth. But this study works in the opposite direction too. Writing of earlier work, but in terms still relevant to Topsail, José Julio García Aránz has noticed, quote, since the world was thought of as a mirror or book, scholars approach nature, or more frequently nature, recreated in books, not in a scientific fashion, but as a means of reaching the transcendent, unquote. They move us to look up as well as down. Now, I'm going to return to the reading of nature as a means of reaching the transcendent, but Aránz's emphasis reminds us of the difficulty of interpreting works such as Topsail's after Francis Bacon. To read Topsail in the negative as not scientific is to flirt with presentism, is to read the beliefs that we have now, beliefs that are the product of Baconianism, is to read those beliefs back onto the past and to inevitably find the past wanting. By implication, it's to assume that the writers and readers of books such as Topsails that included Lamias and Manticores were simply stupid or were simply gullible. And I think that is way too easy and crude an answer as to why the History of Four-Footed Beasts was printed when it was. It would be rather smug for us to look back on the past and find only a foolishness that we happily no longer share. I just always keep thinking, well, in 400 years' time, will people look back on us and think we're stupid? And I then think, in 400 years' time, what if there are no people to look back? That would make us feel really stupid, yeah? So Topsail, we should always remember, presented facts about the natural world to his readers. It's just that what he meant by facts has changed, and we don't consider what he thought of as facts to be facts anymore. The facts we have as facts were constructed by Francis Bacon and his followers, even as Topsail was writing the History of Four-Footed Beasts. So I want to try to read and understand Topsail's history on its own terms, and that's never, ever straightforward. The idea of the emblematic worldview has been one way in which the danger of presentism, of reading Topsail as simply not scientific, has been addressed. But this in itself can create problems. The prevalence of Ashworth's reading in critical interpretations of early modern natural history can also allow readers to avoid really thinking in any details about the text described. You just sort of go, oh, yeah, it's the emblematic worldview, and move on without thinking about what's going on. By interrogating Ashworth's conception, by thinking about how far one can apply it to Topsail's work, I've come to think of the idea of the emblematic worldview as certainly an absolutely key way to thinking about early modern ideas about the natural world, but not in all circumstances. And I came to this conclusion because of a short walk that I took, which made me revise my own and others' interpretation, or rather non-interpretation, because we never bothered to think about this book before. So I literally left the study and moved into the street. I took a stroll from the London Metropolitan Archives to St Botolph's Church in Aldersgate, and that's less than a mile's walk. St Botolph, I discover, is appropriately the patron saint of travellers, so it all begins to make sense. Topsail was the perpetual curate, that is, he had a lifetime vicarage, if you like, at St Botolph's Aldersgate during the time he was writing the history of four-footed beasts. And this is commemorated in a plaque in the church. You can just see at the back, it's a very blurred picture, the word Topsail, I think. But that's the commemoration. Now, this isn't the original church that he preached in. The original church was right on the edge of the Great Fire of London, so it had to be destroyed because it was just too badly damaged. This is a rebuilt church. Topsail's presence in the church can also be traced in the vestry book, which is in the London Metropolitan Archive, which is where I walked from. In this record of church meetings, this is the bit that made me happy. At the bottom, you will see it says the words, "And me, the minister, Edward Topsail." He wrote that. I was pathetically happy. In this book, we find all the records of church meetings and decisions made by the vestry during his ministry. And two of them just kind of stand out to help us explain and understand Topsail. In one of them, he's getting extra money for giving lots of sermons. So this is a very Protestant thing to do. You want to sermonise to get everybody to understand. So he's paid extra because he does a lot. And he actually says at some point he's preached 100 times a year for 20 times together. It's like teaching on a bad first job, isn't it? How many lectures you have to give. We also get a record. The second one here is about the destruction of a window which had a stained glass window with superstitious pictures in it, and it's been replaced with plain glass. So this is the kind of iconoclasm that is famous for the Protestant movement in England. Now that's great, but the church is not only important to us for helping us to understand Topsail's religious beliefs. We can trace that in his written, published writings. I think that what I discovered on my walk through Clerkenwell, from the archives to Topsail's church, is something that has changed how I have thought about this book. Okay, so this is a nice contemporary map of London from 1593. That's Topsail's church. Just to home in on this bit. So that's where Topsail lives. His church is between Smithfield Market and St Paul's Cathedral. It's near St Nicholas Shambles, which is the biggest dead animal market. So Smithfield is the biggest live animal market. St Nicholas Shambles is the biggest dead animal market in London. That's where the Butchers' Hall is, which is where the Guild of the Butchers will meet. And those are drovers' routes into the Smithfield Market. So it's Cow Bridge, Cow Cross Street, Cow Lane. You can still walk down Cow Cross Street and Cow Lane. What I wondered as I was contemplating the geographical location of Topsail's church were the implications of this proximity to the trade in live and dead animals for the author of the History of Four-Footed Beasts. This is a slightly idealised version of Smithfield Market. You can see there's a flock of sheep there and some penned sheep. This is an image of droving in Eastcheap Market, so it gives us a sense of what it might have been like. And if you look at the back in St Nicholas Shambles in the church, you can see all the animal carcasses kind of hung up in the butcher's shops. This is all close to where Topsail was living. When he stepped outside of his church, Edward Topsail would encounter the smells and sounds of animals, perhaps even the actual animals themselves, as they were driven to Smithfield or to the shambles, the butchery, the abattoirs. Surely this must affect how he wrote about them. And I'll be honest, this is where this project began. Having discovered this, I wanted to go back to Topsail and find that he was one of us, that I wasn't going to be a stranger with no one to talk to, that I was going to find in Edward Topsail the friend I'd been longing to have in the 17th century. You can see how badly this story is going to go. I began with this search for Edward Topsail with his book, The Householder or Perfect Man, which is published in 1609. So History of Four-Footed Beasts, 1607, History of Serpents, 1608, Householder or Perfect Man, 1609. This is a series of sermons given in Hartfield in Sussex, a return, he writes in it, after 17 years to the place of his first ministry. In this text, Topsail recognises the significant role that the world can have in human salvation. He says, "Turn therefore your eyes to all things, to gather this wisdom not only to heaven, but to earth, to men, to beasts, to hell, to seas, to all. For a heavenly knowledge of earthly things will help to heaven, An earthly knowledge of heavenly things will send to hell. Now, in the third sermon of the householder, Topsail cites Proverbs 12:10, which is, "A righteous man regardeth the life of his beast," and reminds his audience that the household includes animals and that the perfect man must, quote, "provide hay and grass for cattle." He also notes that, quote, "Our flocks and herds are our families, our cattle, our charge is pastoral and magisterial, kingdoms to kings, monarchies to emperors." Flocks as family, I thought, my God, this could be a post-humanist reading of agriculture. But this is the early 17th century, and we are in the mode of allegory and not HRAE companionability. And Topsail goes on, "Your wives and husbands are also your flock. Our parents are the flock in charge of us that are children, and children are the charge of parents. The servants are also the charge and flock of the master." So it appeared to actually engage with living arrangements with real animals and to be truly concerned with animal welfare quickly slides into allegory. Flocks are family only insofar as care for flocks models allegorically human responsibility to other humans. This slip from reality to allegory, with the latter the most important, becomes even clearer when we think about Topsail's interpretation of the abuse of horses in the streets of London in this text. On one level, it seems way ahead of its time. It's over 250 years before Black Beauty, for example. But on another, it has to be acknowledged that the horses he refers to really only serve to illustrate the centrality the centrality of the allegorical and thus the human in his thinking. Topsail writes, "They are such fools who never cease travailing and labouring, all for their living as if they had at the least a lease of 1,000 years for their life, dealing with their souls as hackneymen with their horses, giving them no rest till they be dead." So the image is there. Topsail is seeing something, but it's translated into allegorical significance. It's a lesson on the human soul, not on the treatment of horses. So this text, written directly after the history of four-footed beasts and the history of serpents, regards animals as a means of regarding humans. Another issue I thought that might allow me to claim that Topsail was engaging with the animal world outside of his window emerged when I looked at the illustrations in the history of four-footed beasts. Of the 63 animals discussed in Topsail's source, Conrad Gesner's first volume of the Historia Animalium, 57 of the illustrations are reused by Topsail. So you have, just to give you two examples, the browner one is the Gesner, the black and white is Topsail. Oh, these are just a couple of examples. But Topsail's cow differs significantly from Gesner's. So this is Gesner's cow, this is Topsail's cow. You can see them together. Topsail's cow, the black and white one, has grass to eat. Her udders are larger, she is fleshier. She seems, dare I suggest, a more contented creature. Did this reflect a hope on Topsail's part, I wondered, that a true cow, a godly cow, should be well fed, fat and alert? Was this evidence that belief, after all, that flocks were family? Unfortunately, scholarly work on the use and selection of illustrations in books such as Gesner's and Topsail's offers another interpretation. Firstly, while images of exotic creatures, in particular the new arrivals from the New World, might be made from life, images of domestic, familiar animals were not likely to be created especially for a book. So the woodcut of, for example, a chameleon, as pictured here in Gesner, would have been different in origin from that of a cat or a rabbit. And you can kind of see the different style here, that the chameleon is an attempt to draw as naturally as this kind of discourse had it. Secondly, printers would reuse images they had to hand. So if a previous publication had an image of a cat in it, that woodcut would be recycled, however different the texts were. And finally, the author himself would be unlikely to have much say in the choice of woodcuts. Gesner was very unusual in that he did try to get involved. He began to see the importance of illustrations in natural historical drawings. So the fact that Topsail's cow is eating grass is likely to have little meaning in itself. And so I had to admit that Topsail was probably not metaphorically providing his beasts with fodder and thus offering an ideal of human treatment of cows. He was, in all likelihood, being given an image that William Jaggard had to hand And it's probably going to be impossible to trace that image because so many texts from this period have not survived. So we just potentially will never know the origin of this picture of a cow. Thus, it has not been possible for me to find in Topsail's work the trail of breadcrumbs that might make possible a path between my modern perceptions of animals and his late Renaissance ones. Despite living near the live and dead animal markets of London, Topsail seems to have failed to include what he saw in his writing. His aim was, I had to admit, utterly anthropocentric. In his epistle dedicatory to the history of four-footed beasts, Topsail wrote that his main focus was on showing, quote, showing unto men what beasts are their friends and what their enemies, which to trust and which to avoid, in which to find nourishment and which to shun as poison. So it's the human use of animals that's central. No animal in Topsail is studied for its own sake. But it's not all negative. While searching for Topsail's recognition of the reality of animals in the world he inhabited, a rather different issue emerged. In my reading across a variety of creatures in that text, it became clear that different kinds of animals, domestic, tame, wild, exotic, monstrous, seem to elicit different kinds of representation and interpretation, which makes the claim for a singular, all-encompassing, emblematic worldview difficult to sustain. Thus, exotic animals such as the elephant and monstrous creatures like the lamia produce different kinds of meaning from commonplace beings like the cow. Indeed, Topsail's discussion of the ox and the cow, that's the title of the largest section in the chapter of the bull, and that gives you a sense of the gendering of these texts. The chapter's called the bull, but most of it's about the cow. That section on the ox and the cow begins with the statement, quote, "We are now to describe those beasts which are less foreign and strange and more commonly known to all nations than any other four-footed beast." And the section seems to contain very little that might be read allegorically. Recognising this raises interesting questions, and I'm not sure still whether the questions I'm raising about this are questions of a stranger or questions of somebody who is meant to be asking these questions. So the ox and the cow start, as all chapters in this book do, with the etymology of the name. The link between cattle and chattel, between animal and money, is made. It then goes on to describe the different breeds of cattle across the world, and then Topsail turns specifically to the dairy cow, and milk becomes his focus. Cows are, he says, lustful creatures. They can predict the weather, and light women were in ancient times called heifers. A statement which leads Topsail to discuss Io, the woman metamorphosed into a cow by Jove, in order to disguise his lust for her from Juno in Ovid's Metamorphosis. And this, in turn, leads Topsail directly to think about the buying and selling of cows. And I've just given you this chunk of text so you can see it's a direct link. Now, paragraphing, again, is something that was invented by modern grammar, so we shouldn't read too much into the fact that there are no paragraph difference. But what is important is there's almost no line difference between the discussing of Io, this mythical cow, or woman transformed into a cow, and how to go about buying the best cow. I'm going to come back to the weird logic of that. Then Topsail outlines what he's to feed them, their housing, cures to heal bovine sickness, what cures which come from the Roman author Columella, how to train oxen, their understanding of their own name, their friendship with their yoke-mate, the enmity they feel towards wolves. Wolves did not live in England and hadn't done so since the late 15th century. And at this point, two sayings are included, both of which are explicitly noted as proverbs. And in the elephant and lamia chapters, no such signposting exists. So Topsail doesn't only reproduce the proverbs and name them as such, he also interprets them for us, which again hasn't happened before. So he says, "An ox raiseth dust which blindeth his own eyes," quote, and goes on to signify that foolish and indiscreet men stir up the occasion of their own harms. Now, following this brief foray into the proverbial, he then notes that there are two further uses of ox and the cow to outline, the natural and the moral. Natural includes an outline of feeding times, which sides logically in his world, into which animal provides the best flesh, apparently a young ox, and then to the use of horn, skin, dung, and meat, and their medicinal value. Then emerged the moral, by which he means religious uses of the animal. This includes the outline of the, quote, dignity and high account the animal was held in because of its centrality to agriculture in the ancient world and its use in sacrificial rites. Now, much of Topsail's chapter on the cow includes the same information that can be found in early animal healthcare manuals. Unlike his treatment of the elephant, this is not a discussion of myths and legends. It is instead a prosaic outline of cattle management. The emblematic worldview only seems to emerge really in the Proverbs, which makes me wonder how valid that worldview is as a way of explaining all animals in the natural history of that period. For Topsail's discussion of cows, I'm led to ask whether some animals are more emblematic than others. This is an idea which leads me to wonder further if, through the process of emblematizing, animals are supposed to be a means of reaching the transcendent. Is a cow less transcendental than a bear in early modern England? Is it a more fleshy and so less spiritually powerful creature than an elephant? The lack of emblematic meaning given to oxen and cows is what is a mainly emblematic text tells us, I think, something about perceptions of them. And I would argue it tells us something about how the emblematic worldview works. There's another walk to be taken here. And in early modern London, you'd have to get a boat across the river. Now there's a nice bridge called the Millennium Bridge. Heading south from Topsail's church, which is at the top of the image, is the Rose Theatre. I've ringed it at the bottom, where in circa 1592 Shakespeare's 2 Henry VI was first performed. In Act 3, Scene 1 of that play, one of King Henry's advisors, the Duke of Gloucester, is removed from his side by the argumentative Queen and her followers. And the weak king is left to mourn. And he says, "Thou never didst them wrong, nor no man wrong." And as the butcher takes away the calf and binds the wretch and beats it when it strays, bearing it to the bloody slaughterhouse, even so remorseless have they borne him hence. And as the dam runs lowing up and down, looking the way her harmless young one went, and so can do naught but wail her darling's lost, even so myself bewails good Gloucester's case. Now, what is the function of Shakespeare's bovine image here? What does the extended cow conceit allow the king to say that could not be said without it? I want to suggest that the king's self-representation, not as a lion, for example, but as a cow, is important because hierarchical order was central to the correct use of metaphor in the period. At the end of the 16th century, John Hoskins argued that the transport, and the Latin for metaphor is translatio, that the transport from one image to another that is inherent in metaphor should be from the original to, quote, a thing of equal or greater dignity, unquote. In this context, a king should never be compared to a cow. George Putnam, writing in 1589, noted that when an untrue application of one term for another, when a thing of unequal or lesser dignity is used, this is, he called, plain abuse. And the image he uses to kind of give us an example of this is of the phrase rascal knave for a poor man. Rascal, Putnam says, is, quote, properly the hunter's term given to a young deer lean and out of season and not to people, unquote. Henry's self-reduction to the status of a cow would seem apt then at this moment in the play. The king figures his own diminishing power through an animal image. He is being self-catacritical, you might say. But there's more that can be said in about the comparison here too. The king portrays himself as being emasculated, and yet in choosing a cow he has simultaneously figured himself as a source of nourishment for the nation. The cow's losing her calf is, from a milk-drinking human perspective, nutritionally necessary, but it's also, when seen from the cow's perspective, and that's how the king ultimately sees it, personally painful. The image thus offers up an intricate variety of ideas about the monarch's status at this point in the play, a variety that asks us to reflect on generalisations such as the nature of kingship and thus national safety and well-being, as well as the specifics of personal loss. Now, recognising that the image speaks to the importance of particular as well as abstract experience brings to the fore the fact that the extended conceit requires us to focus on the reality of a cow's response to the loss of her calf and not to pass over it to reach the true human response. We need to home in not on the emblematic possibilities embodied in the animal, such as is found in the image of the sheep as being truly humble, but on the actual processes of an agricultural relation that allow the king to make meaning. Usual emblematic meaning is anthropocentric. It sees a human narrative being read into an animal's life, the lion cubs figuring Christ, the elephant as a model of generosity, and in turn returning and reinforcing and naturalising the human narrative. So it might look something like that. Shakespeare's image offers us an alternative conceptual use of animals in which the reality of their lives makes sense of human life, in which they, in short, they are primary and we are secondary in the making of meaning. The very fact that Shakespeare could use a cow in this way is important. It suggests first that the cow was an animal whose being in the world was expected to be understood by a London theatre audience. And second, that being was assumed to be in some crucial ways translatable into a human way of being without entering the realm of allegory. In Shakespeare's image, I suggest the cow is not humanised, and I'm not even sure that the human is bovinised. I think equivalency is being proposed. The animal's presence in early modern culture, it's in fields, in its streets, was central to how the dairy cow was interpreted, or how it was not interpreted in emblematic writing, and that's the important thing. And so while a cow wasn't very emblematically powerful, and was, by the logic of that worldview, less transcendental than other creatures, maybe that was because it could be and was being understood in another equally powerful way, as being more like us, flesh, blood, feeling, mourning. The cow, as Shakespeare's King Henry VI puts it, wails her darling's loss. Now, if this is the case, then Edward Topsail's apparent lack of interest in the world of some of the real animals he lived in such close proximity to is really worth pausing over. If the cow was understood or understandable to be like us in her feelings by his contemporaries, then how could those feelings be excluded from Topsail's discussion and his discussion be truly godly? If Shakespeare's image worked, and I think we have to assume it did, why was the cow not an emblem of natural maternal love in the history of four-footed beasts? Why was she not an accepted model for the good woman? If the aim of Topsail's book was to understand God's creation in order to understand God himself, ignoring some aspects of the natural world would seem to be putting limits both on God and on the reader's engagement with him. Now, Topsail clearly did look out of his window. He did live in the real world of daily encounters of animals. We have that in the image he uses of the hackney horse, which of course he then translates into an allegory, but he is seeing something. What's interesting is he still didn't think that what he saw needed to be represented in the history of four-footed beasts. So the question I have is why? Now, until now, his modern readers, and I include myself in this because I've been using him for a very long time, we've either not asked this question or have regarded it as irrelevant, saying that this is how things were in the period, that in the emblematic worldview, books were the source of truth more than reality. The logic of this response is that Topsail himself has no place at all. He was simply a translator or a bridger of someone else's work. He was not free to respond on his own terms, it's assumed, but was restricted by what has gone before, or was limited, almost in a mindless way, by the genre in which he was writing. By implication, translation and genre writing somehow magically managed to stand outside of their own context and to be untouched by the world. Now, this interpretation is clearly a cop-out, and not only because it's a dubious conception of translation and genre writing, but also because it evacuates a human being from the picture. I think Topsail had agency. I think he made choices as to what he did include and what he didn't include, and we need to pay attention to that. But as well as this, the interpretation that omits Topsail still leaves the question as to why he thought people would want a book such as The History of Four-Footed Beasts in a world that understood the link between humans and cows. And I think we can return to the problem of Io. If you remember, there was that very close correlation between Io and the buying and selling of cows in Topsail's chapter to answer this. So in George Sandy's English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses from less than 20 years after Topsail's History of Four-Footed Beasts, the story of Io's transformation into a cow is told once again. Io's father, Inachus, responds in the following terms when he recognises that the beautiful cow before him is his child. She has, using her hoof, like Pliny's elephant using his trunk, managed to write her name in the dust. He says, "Dumb wretch, alas, thou canst not make reply. Yet as thou canst, thou dost. Thy lowings speak, and deep-fetched sighs that from thy bosom break." For Inachus, it's not Io's hoof-writing that's articulate, it is her lowing, her bovine voice. In Topsail's discussion of cows, this story of Io leads directly into directions on the buying and selling of cattle. The link is uncomfortable. It seems to step unconcernedly over a boundary that should be impassable. As Shakespeare's Titus Andronicus, a play probably written maybe 2 years after the cow image in 2 Henry VI, in this play he's shown it's only in a world in which order has collapsed, a world of despotism, infanticide, cannibalism and rape, that a daughter needs to write in the sand to be understood, and that children become pie-filling. When viewed in this context, maybe Topsail's juxtaposition of Io and the selling of cows is worth thinking about as more than a manifestation of a very poor organisation of ideas. Maybe it's a deliberate linking, or maybe even an unconscious linking of a story from the Metamorphosis in which a human is a cow and to what we do to cows. So for Topsail, and this is purely speculative, but this is where I'm at so far, for Topsail, maybe living near live and dead animal markets was unpalatable because he lived in a world and inhabited a natural historical worldview in which a number of contradictory things coincided. The assumed similarity of cow and human, the argument that linked animals with the transcendent, and the utterly quotidian slaughter of cattle. Perhaps it's because of the discomfort of the coincidence of these incompatible things that so little could be said and thought about real cows in the history of four-footed beasts. Perhaps there are some things that make metaphor and allegory of the emblematic worldview impossible. And living in a church near Smithfield Market in the early 17th century was one of them. Maybe human use of cows undermined Topsail's theodicy. Maybe they made it impossible for him to justify the ways of God to men. In this context, in this potentially blasphemous context for a minister, silence might have been preferable. But this silence speaks. Like Io, it articulates even as it is without words. Perhaps Topsail did want to recognise what he saw. Maybe he found it impossible to live only in the private space of the study when the world outside was so literally and theologically present to him. Perhaps juxtaposition is the closest he could get to writing about what was unspeakable, and his bringing together of incompatible ideas allowed a glimpse of a thought that, for this early modern Protestant clergyman, buying meat was like buying someone's daughter. That however nutritious it was, drinking milk did not, like wine, symbolise everlasting life, but instead ought to mind constant death. Shakespeare, less concerned in the second part of Henry VI with the transcendent nature of God's creation, could make the link explicit. Topsail, the clergyman in whose theology the material world was a manifestation of God, could not. I'm reminded at this point of Elizabeth Costello, wondering at the end of Kurt Sayers' Lives of Animals how one can live in a world in which slaughter is so normal. This is the quote, you'll all recognise it. "I no longer know where I am. I seem to move around perfectly easily among people, to have perfectly normal relations with them. Is it possible, I ask myself, that all of them are participants in a crime of stupefying proportions? Am I fantasising it all? I must be mad. Yet every day I see the evidences. The very people I suspect produce the evidence, exhibit it, offer it to me. Corpses, fragments of corpses they have bought for money. As Schaefer and Chafin recognised, the member who poses awkward questions about what everybody knows in the shared culture runs a real risk of being dealt with as a troublemaker or an idiot. With this choice available, perhaps remaining silent is the best response. But that doesn't mean that what is unspeakable cannot be expressed. Maybe for one clergyman in London in 1607, the deep-fetched sighs were from both human and animal bosoms. Maybe Topsail's encounters with the cattle he saw in the world around his church led him to feel as Inachus had in Arthur Golding's earlier, first translation of Ovid from 1567. Thou stand'st as dumb, and to my words no answer can thou give, but from the bottom of thy heart full sorry sighs dost drive, as tokens of thine inward grief, and dolefully dost moo unto my talk, the only thing left in thy power to do. Io drives the sighs from her heart like humans drive the cattle to market, and Topsail has only one thing left in his power to do, to stand dumb like a cow. Thank you.